Welcome to the Aced It podcast, where we turn science into sense. This is the 14th season of Aced It, and we are so incredibly grateful that we are able to deliver rich scientific content to you in a usable and understandable way. Aced It is brought to you via the Justice Community Overdose Innovation Network, or JCOIN. If you're new to Aced It, welcome. We're so glad you're here. And check out the prior seasons to begin or continue your learning journey. A special thank you to every wonderful listener. We promise we will continue working to help you learn and grow via Aced It. Also, a quick plug for a few other JCOIN features. Did you know you can get technical assistance for your organization from the experts at JCOIN? And did you know you can apply for a small research grant to help fund an innovative study idea? Yep, through JCOIN. And did you know you can apply to be a JCOIN LEAP scholar or investigator, a year-long mentorship that will improve your skills? Also through, you got it, JCOIN. If any or all of these exciting offerings sound interesting, check out our website, JCOIN-CTC.org, and learn about the many JCOIN courses, products, and opportunities beyond Aced It, all designed to translate science into sense for you. With that, I am honored that you're with us. I'm Danielle Rudes, your host, and this is Aced It. Welcome to the first episode of Season 14 of the Aced It podcast, about the stories we tell about drugs and overdose. This season, we're exploring the narratives told about drugs and overdose, who gets to tell them, and the narratives they choose to spread. Ultimately, these narratives shape stigma, guide policy responses, and affect access to treatment. To start the season, we need to talk about stigma, what it is, how it shapes the experiences of people who use drugs, how it shapes reactions to overdoses, and why language and narratives matter so much when we talk about drugs, overdose, and addiction. Stigma is one of the most powerful forces shaping how society responds to substance use disorder and overdose. It influences how people who use drugs are treated by healthcare providers, how communities respond to overdoses, and how loved ones are supported after someone dies. Let's get into it. Okay, so first, what is stigma and what are the different types of stigma? Lucky for us, McGinty and Berry in 2020 wrote a great article laying this all out, so let's go through that all together. When researchers talk about stigma in relation to addiction, they're referring to more than just negative attitudes. Stigma is a social process that involves labeling, stereotyping, status loss, and discrimination against a particular group. In the context of addiction, it often stems from the belief that drug use reflects personal failure, poor choices, or a lack of willpower, rather than a health condition shaped by social, psychological, and biological factors. Because addiction is frequently interpreted through this moral lens, people who use drugs are often judged as personally responsible for their situation. These assumptions about blame and responsibility are central to how stigma operates. So now we've covered stigma, or what it is, let's go through the different types of stigma that people can experience. Researchers often describe stigma as occurring at several levels. One form is public stigma, which refers to negative attitudes and stereotypes held by the general public. Public stigma can lead to social rejection, discrimination, and reduced willingness to support policies that help people with substance use disorders. There's also structural stigma, which occurs when institutions and policies reinforce these beliefs. Laws, healthcare policies, and funding decisions can all reflect assumptions about who deserves care and who should instead be punished or excluded. And finally, there is self-stigma. This occurs when people who use drugs internalize the negative messages they hear about addiction. What then happens is individuals may begin to see themselves through the same stigmatizing lens, feeling shame, hiding their substance use, or avoiding treatment altogether. Together, these forms of stigma create an environment where people struggling with addiction may face judgment not only from society, but also from institutions and sometimes from within themselves. Okay, so now that we have a basic understanding of what stigma is, let's talk about how people who use drugs experience stigma. Stigma affects many aspects of life for people who use drugs, including how they interact with healthcare systems, law enforcement, and their communities. One study, conducted by Larson and colleagues in 2025, interviewed people who had recently experienced or witnessed an overdose and found that many participants described stigmatizing interactions with healthcare providers, first responders, and police. These encounters made people less willing to seek help or trust medical professionals in the future. These experiences often reflect underlying assumptions about blame. When addiction is framed primarily as a personal choice, people who use drugs may be viewed as responsible for their circumstances and therefore less deserving of care. Beyond help seeking, stigma also shapes the environments where people choose to use drugs, which can directly affect overdose risk. In their qualitative study conducted in rural Kentucky, Fandinelli and colleagues 2020 found that fear of judgment, criminalization, and likelihood of arrest influenced where young adults use opioids. In their write-up, they made this super cool diagram that basically goes over all the different factors that influence where people use drugs. At the macro level, they explored physical environments, for example, ruralness and poor cell signal, political environments, for example, Good Samaritan laws, social environments, for example, community stigma, and the criminal legal environment, for example, the war on drugs. Then, at the micro level, they explored the political environment. For example, people might not fully understand Good Samaritan laws, and the healthcare service environment. For example, lack of access to naloxone, a medicine that reverses the effects of a drug overdose. Okay, sorry. Thanks for letting me nerd out about this diagram. I just thought it was really interesting. I'll get back to the big picture now, I promise. Okay, basically, they found that because communities in rural areas tend to be tightly interconnected, people worried that being labeled as someone who uses drugs would quickly become known to others. Once individuals were identified in this way, they often experienced discrimination in employment, healthcare access, and interactions with law enforcement. As a result, many participants preferred to use drugs in private settings, where they could avoid stigma and surveillance. But these decisions sometimes created new risks. Using alone or in hidden environments reduces the likelihood that someone will be present to administer naloxone or call for help during an overdose. So the takeaway from all of this is that stigma doesn't just influence attitudes, it can shape the risk environment surrounding drug use. Of course, stigma also continues after an overdose occurs. According to Larson and colleagues, 2025, people who survive overdoses may encounter judgment or blame when they interact with healthcare providers or emergency responders. These reactions can discourage people from seeking help again, even when they need medical care or support. Public attitudes toward overdose deaths often reflect similar patterns of blame. Sawyer, 2024, conducted what's called a vignette study to examine how the public perceives people who die from fentanyl overdoses. In this study, respondents from across the United States were shown 2 fictional overdose obituaries and asked to compare the people who died on several outcomes, including blameworthiness and support for interventions such as treatment, government aid, or punishment. Each obituary randomly varied the characteristics of the decedent, including race, gender, age, socioeconomic status, substance use history, and drug type, to isolate how these factors shaped public perceptions. The results show that stigma toward people who die from overdose is driven primarily by perceived personal responsibility rather than demographic characteristics. Substance use history and drug type were the strongest predictors of blame. With individuals who had previously used drugs, especially those described as struggling with addiction for many years, and those intending to use heroin or cocaine, judged as significantly more responsible for their overdose. Age also mattered, as older individuals were more likely to be blamed and less likely to receive support for interventions, often because respondents believed they, quote, should have known better, unquote. In contrast, race, Gender and socioeconomic status had relatively little influence on blame or intervention preferences. Overall, respondents tended to evaluate overdose victims through a quote-unquote meritocratic lens, emphasizing personal choices and individual responsibility. Now, stigma also affects loved ones after they have lost someone to a drug overdose. A study by Dragov and Selsing, 2022, examined the experiences of people bereaved by drug-related deaths, found that nearly half of the participants reported encountering stigmatizing remarks after their loss. Most of these remarks came from family and friends, work colleagues, neighbors, media and social media, and professionals. Comments often included derogatory labels for the deceased or statements suggesting that the person's death was inevitable or the result of their own choices. People were labeled as, quote, junkies, unquote, and, quote, scum, unquote, or, quote, not right in the head, unquote. And loved ones were told that the deceased had, quote, made their choices and suffered the consequences, unquote, or that they are, quote, lucky to have been spared any further anguish when he died, unquote. For loved ones already navigating grief, these responses can deepen isolation and reinforce the idea that their loss is somehow less legitimate or less worthy of compassion. And finally, we need to talk about language and narratives, because stigma is shaped by how society interprets addiction. Language and narratives play a powerful role in shaping public attitudes. According to Atayed and colleagues 2021, who reviewed the existing literature on this topic, words carry emotional meaning and social associations. Labels such as, quote, junkie or addict, unquote, reinforce stereotypes and can contribute to discrimination in healthcare, media coverage, and everyday conversations. In one of the studies that they reviewed, participants who encountered the phrase, quote, substance abuser, unquote, were more likely to believe the person deserved punishment and posed a threat to society. When the same condition was described as, quote, having a substance use disorder, unquote, respondents expressed less support for punitive action. These findings highlight how narratives can shape perceptions of blame and responsibility. Now, according to McGinty and Berry, again in 2020, communication strategies can help reduce stigma when they highlight effective treatment options and emphasize the broader social factors that contribute to addiction. Research suggests that messages focusing on solutions, compassion, and recovery may increase support for treatment and health responses. Similarly, studies on public attitudes toward harm reduction programs show that how programs are named and framed can influence whether people support them. For instance, a study by Johnston and Thompson, 2024, found that messaging that emphasizes saving lives and helping people receive care tends to generate more public support than language focused solely on drug use itself. In other words, the way we talk about addiction helps determine whether society responds with punishment, indifference, or care. So that wraps up everything I wanted to talk with you about today. In closing, stigma is not just about words or attitudes. It shapes policies, treatment access, and the environments in which people use drugs. It influences whether individuals seek help, how communities respond to overdoses, and how loved ones are supported after loss. And as we'll explore throughout this season, stigma is deeply connected to the stories society tells about drugs and addiction. In the episodes ahead, we'll look at how different institutions like healthcare systems, media organizations, pop culture, public health agencies, and the criminal legal system and beyond help construct these narratives. Because the stories we tell about drugs and overdose don't just describe reality, they shape it. Thank you so much for listening to the ACE-IT podcast. We love hearing from you, so if you have comments, topics to suggest, or some science you'd like us to cover in a future season, please write to me, Danielle Rudes at Sam Houston State University. My email is drudes@shsu.edu. And of course, thank you to the Justice Community Overdose Innovation Network, JCOIN's Coordination and Translation Center, funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, housed at George Mason University, where this podcast originated. Thank you to our fabulous scriptwriter team and also my fabulous doctoral students at Sam Houston State University, Bryce Kushmerek-McCune, Jalen Magana, and Alexa Mata. And a huge and a heartfelt thank you to the team at Slonky LLC for their wonderful podcast production as always. Tune in again soon for another episode of Aced It.